Thank you all for being here. It's lovely to see so many. Thank you to my hosts for such a lovely visit, and to everybody who planned and coordinated. Am I not on the mic? Is that better? Okay. I'll try not to drift. So yeah, I was just thanking everyone for kind of inviting me and for organizing my visit. I'm very excited to be here. So my talk today is, I'm very excited to see the book is in paperback now. It was previously only available in hardcover and digitally, so there's a big stack of them, which I'm not shy to admit I'm very happy to see. It's still kind of a thrill. It's like, that's my book. And so what I thought I would do was talk a little bit from that book, from the third chapter of that book, for those of you who may have read it, without any expectations that you have, and kind of connect that with some things I've been thinking about subsequently that are maybe part of a new book down the road. So many of Freedom Time's claims have to do with the past unwieldy inheritance and the ways it presents itself simultaneously as resource and impediment. A chapter on the poet Harriet Mullen and the playwright Susan Laurie Parks, for example, thinks about the ways they rework the blues as a set of relationships between rhetoric, especially irony, and the production of new social and political vernaculars through which they gesture toward new possible forms of community. Likewise, in a chapter on Claudia Rankine and Douglas Kearney, which I'll be revisiting today, I wanted to think about the ways they inherit and rework a certain lyric tradition toward new possibilities of expression and new imaginings of racial selfhood. And I'll unpack throughout this talk what I mean by lyric tradition, because even for literary specialists, it's not a term that's uncontroversial. So as I write, Freedom Time deploys, quoting myself, a situated formalism that remains attentive to the specificity of the moment of a text's emergence, the events to which it refers, and the formal conventions or techniques the work repurposes or reconstitutes. Reading for those three, as the situation seems to require, I attempt to move beyond literary politics as scholars of African diaspora literature customarily conceive them in order and move from that to a new mode of criticism mindful of the radical implications of formal innovation as a mode of social engagement. So there are a few things that I'm trying to do there. One of them is just saying that experimental literature isn't something that's just for kind of coterie, but is its own form of social engagement. And it's a form of social engagement that asks us to reimagine the social, which is, is perhaps arguable, but that's the basic gambit of the book. Back to the talk. Experimentation in this book thus does not refer only to an aesthetic category of innovation as typically conceived, but also to the use of literature to reconfigure blackness and of blackness to reconfigure literature. It names the literary response that occurs when thinking comes up against what W.E.B. Du Bois termed the limitations of allowable thought, norms of racialized reading and the contemporary racial order. In the phrase Black experimental writing, therefore, Black modifies experimental, and experimental modifies Black. I offer Black experimental writing as a term that describes both the formally innovative writing practices of Black writers and the ways such writing transforms our understanding of race, starting from the assumption that literature does something other than produce knowledge or answer, for example, an implicit, how does it feel to be a problem, which was Du Bois's famous question from the beginning of The Souls of Black Folk. Not exactly providing a differently hued narrative of the avant-garde, Freedom Time draws attention to the theoretical implications of Black experimental writing, guided in part by the notion that literature produces its own acts of theory and self-differentiation, rather than providing a vanguardist model to follow or confirmation of some broader truth in the world or of a theoretical stance. The shifts in the kinds of questions texts ask and the claims or demands texts make on readers is the place from which I interrogate the politics of literature, close quote. The arguments throughout the book return repeatedly to the ways Black experimental writing makes political demands in the present by insisting on the unrecognizable, on what remains unrealized from the past, on what remains unthinkable in the present. But most generally, I wanted to make a case for these writers as intellectual, and for literature as their medium of thought, governed by its own historical and institutional norms that are inflected by the prevailing political situation in which we work, but not strictly determined by them. And the intervention there is to kind of want to move away from some of the ways that there's a certain model of literary history and of reading for literary politics that would say, this book comes out in 65, the Voting Rights Act passes in 65, this book is somehow responding to the Voting Rights Act, and wanting to say, well, sure, that's one of the things that it may have on its mind, but anybody who writes, it takes so long that by the time 65 comes around, that's maybe one layer on top of many other things that a writer might be thinking about. And so taking them seriously as intellectuals is a way of saying, sure, they're aware of their moment, but they're also aware of other things and trying to get us to move towards something else, whether we go there or not. And I wanted to think about the ways these writers as intellectuals were engaged in a project of producing the future otherwise, on terms that did not assume, for example, that the equality of opportunity achieved by the political organizing and mobilizing of previous generations satisfied the demands for freedom around which people rallied. As I wrote the book, and especially as I returned to those concerns, I find myself thinking in different terms about the present as a way of stabilizing the incoherencies and contradictions of ordinary common time. And so there's a distinction I'm making drawing from the work of the literary critic Lauren Berlant between the now, the kind of everyday punctual moment, and the present, which I'll unpack in a minute, but that's just to kind of flag that. Freedom time is invested in the ways writing attempts to intervene in and define its present, which is an inherently political project. Increasingly, thinking about my own process, I've been thinking about the ways the present, occurrences somewhere between ordinary time and events, inevitably intervenes in the process of composition. Among other things, I've been thinking about the recent increased awareness of the murders against Black people committed by the state and those who understand themselves to have state sanction. One could list their names as one would the Civil War dead, calling names such as Ayanna Stanley Jones, Tyree King, Philando Castile, and many more thousands gone. I'll return to these acts of memorialization towards the end of this talk when I talk about Citizen, Claudia Rankine's recent work that many of you are probably familiar with, at least in passing. Because I'm a poetry scholar primarily, my mind, though, in thinking about process of composition went to Ed Roberson's early work, which, like Nathaniel Mackey's spatial experimentation with above and below the line poems, which, like Nathaniel Mackey's work, experiments with above and below the line poems, a kind of spatial division. So the two apparently distinct poems occupy the same page, and their relationship is never fully clear. His third collection, Lucid Interval as Integral Music, appears divided into two sections, separated spatially into areas of the page. The top poems are numbered with Roman numerals 1 through 46, while the bottom, 1 through 45, while the bottom, separated from the top with the graphic line, are numbered with Arabic numerals 1 to 46. The two poems do not always directly interact beyond their graphic coincidence. Referring to the two poems as voices, Roberson treats them as part of a ritual speech situation where each requires the other for coherence. And since we were just talking at my table about the church, there's a nice resonance there, quoting Roberson. The upper voice is the poem, and the bottom voice is the one that's singing over or singing under, in the sense that it's mumbling, or that deep humming you hear in church while the minister is preaching, and somebody in the back is what they call mourning, close quote. Reading the collection as one single poem, rather than the kinds of discrete poems that lend themselves to anthologization, the poem sits in that unruly interval separating and connecting visual, oral, and oral script without choosing. Each exists, borrowing from Nathaniel Mackey, as lines of articulation that are wrestling, that are somehow each other's contagion or contamination, close quote. Neither refusing nor fully embracing the singular voice as a way of instantiating the stability of a speaking subject and allowing history to enter the work that way, Roberson's work remains open, multiple, multivalent. It makes its own incompletion productive. The image I keep returning to then is from the first section, the very opening of the poem, which makes the cry of a child at once theme and formal principle. And here I'm just going to quote the opening lines, and I'll note that there's a line break before the word hold, which is isolated in the fourth of the 4 lines that I'm going to read. This form is the Lena after my daughter. Here she is, I will have to hold on a minute, tell you her line. Lena is Roberson's then infant daughter's name. She, within the fiction of the poem, and no doubt within the reality of his life, made him rearrange his days so that he worked in the intervals when he was not, quoting him, an unspeakable watch of that without tongue, close quote. The lack of coordination makes the meaning of the word after uncertain. That is, this form is the Lena after my daughter. It is either a form named in honor of her, following her arrival. Sorry, I just did something to the screen. Let's move this a little bit even more out of the way. Following her arrival or following her example. In the conventions of poetry, you'll often say this poem is after a line by so-and-so. And I could either mean after this line or just in the style of. The after suggests 2 different relationships to time, one of dedication based on the name and one of pursuit, of an attempt to fix or affix, to bring her into discourse. One conclusion is that the poem occupies a different temporal register from what it attempts to capture. Though, unlike the photo, that is, the poem isn't just like a photograph which faithfully reproduces something that was in front of the lens, which we know something had to have been there. Sorry, my pages are out of order. But rather, there's something even more ephemeral, the poem's enacting a parent's reaction to a squirming child, so that there's something there but also not there in a certain sense. Hold is suspended, and it vacillates noisily between orders of discourse. It remains uncertain whether the syntax should read, I will have to hold, and the thought that's interrupted, or hold on a minute. The colloquial phrase, the former would just be declarative, the latter would break the syntax of the sentence altogether to introduce a new idea abruptly. The echo of the second part of the first poem, or the second version, that is the below the line poem, begins still autonomic, still as, in a slightly smaller typeface. The potential imperative of hold prepares us to read still as the same imperative, and as in the biblical peace, be still. Though one wonders how to bring autonomy or the comparative impulse named by as, still as, to a halt, or into what opaque interval we've stumbled at this point in the poem. The poem renders time processual but also recursive, and still someone must speak after the poem, as that last line suggests. So, and here I'm kind of in miniature outlining how there are temporal concerns and how those work and are threaded through all of my readings, kind of thinking about poetry in particular and what it does with time, how it asks us to rethink time, and how that kind of reverberates out into everyday life. In an interview, Roberson discusses these lines, quoting him. This early part tells about the experience of the fragment. The opening section, picking up the tune, the universe, and planets, explains how the poem was written and opens what is going to happen. When you get all the way back to this week's concert at the end of the poem, then it's beginning to talk about those words as divination, finding a deep meaning and emotional catch in words. But you have to stop even hunting for that if you've got a baby to take care of. This business about her being Chance, she is Chance to deal with. You asked about Chance, and that's what she is. The whole book is playing with that. The experience of the fragment starts to capture what I meant by post-lyric in Freedom Time. I refer neither to a rejection of the lyric, a tradition in the African-American which in the African-American tradition is capacious enough to hold both Langston Hughes and Conte Cullen, the work song and Robert Hayden, Method Man and Rita Dove. Nor is it a faithful reproduction of his structuring logics. And let me just pause here. A lyric has come to dominate for most of us our sense of what poetry is. They're typically short, they're typically written around intense emotional experiences. They typically feature or are imagined to feature the work of a speaker addressing, either directly addressing an audience or just directly addressing in a way that anyone can understand him or herself to be the audience. And so there's a way in which all the way from, say, Paul Laurence Dunbar to many people in the present, that persists. And yet I want to say that maybe it's better to say a kind of oppositional or an alternative practice of the lyric that I've been trying to draw out. And these poems constitute a dialectical interruption of the genre from within its terms. They ask us to rethink what even are we doing? What is it to read or to write a poem like this, to expect to be addressed? And to expect to be addressed in a way that we're not answerable. In Freedom Time, I define post-lyric poetics as the following. Post-lyric poetics use certain recognizable strategies, such as direct address, in ways that disrupt the genre's hermeneutic enclosure, which figures the expressions and experiences of a singular intending consciousness, too often taken to be metonymic for the raced subject. Roberson's deterrent poetic techniques invite readers to trouble and reconceive ideas of voice and identity, emphasizing the moment of self-expression as a moment of self-othering. Doing so, his work highlights the moment of expression as articulation, now on its way to becoming the present. These gaps in Roberson's poetry, the voices that crisscross his text and refuse closure, reflect an interest in the workedness of the poem, in its open and opening relationship to readers trained to find meanings, perhaps particularly in Black text, only in narrowly prescribed avenues. And at least in this poem, the unpredictable vitality of the child is a key. So if post-lyric refers to the use of received understandings of the lyric as a horizon of expectation, only to disrupt the very basis of that mode, I want to say now that we should not just emphasize the assumed solidity of the speaking universal I, but the store of tropes central to the self-styled lyric utterances claim to knowledge. For this, I'm going to make a brief detour through the work of William Wordsworth, who's really foundational to this particular understanding of poetry and the English tradition. In a forthcoming article, I suggest connections between Wordsworth's definition of a poet as a man speaking to other men and Thomas Jefferson's dismissal of Phillis Wheatley's poetry, which requires, in effect, categorically denying her belonging to men. You may recall in the notes on the state of Virginia, in the midst of a whole other an unrelated conversation, Jefferson pauses to talk about the fact, to insist on the inferiority of the Africans as part of an argument against racial mixture, as an argument for repatriating the enslaved and their descendants after the end of slavery. And he says, religion has produced a Phillis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. And so there, I would want to read that alongside. If we read that alongside Wordsworth, the man talking to men, and we say that Phillis Wheatley can't be that, then we can kind of think about some of the recent work around the new lyric studies, where Virginia Jackson, among others, has pointed out the degree to which she's pointed to a process she calls lyricization, whereby every poem we read, we now expect to read in the terms of the lyric. We expect to read it in the terms of a man talking to men, and to kind of unpack the speech situation and read it as a kind of miniature drama. And what that ends up doing, it has the effect of making it much more difficult to read forms of poetry that don't operate along in those ways. We instead force them into the form of the lyric. And just as an example, I mentioned the kind of war memorialization as one of the functions, the older and continuing functions of poetry. The Star-Spangled Banner itself is in the form, the "Oh say can you see by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we held in the twilight's last gleaming." Right, if you just think about the rhythm of that, it's meant to, I forget the name of that, I think it's anacreon or anacreontic, but at any rate, it's entirely engineered to be for you to memorize it, for you to hear it, and then be able to go to the next town and recite what happened in this battle, so that it was a form of just transmitting news that if you read it as lyric, which many of the stanzas do, especially the ones celebrating, that no runaway slave will survive, it just makes Francis Scott Key look like a bad guy instead of, it doesn't really ask us to think about how are those ideas actually connected as part of telling news about the War of 1812. So my point is really simple, is that what Virginia Jackson calls lyricization dovetails with and participates in a common project of consolidating what Sylvia Wynter has called the, I'm quoting Wynter, now globally hegemonic ethnoclass of man, a synecdoche that makes a subset of people, the rising middle class white Western Europeans, the image of the human as such. Jefferson, perhaps more than Wordsworth, was consciously invested in that project. But my broader point is that lyricization corresponds with and provides an aesthetic basis for, that is, a set of common norms of beauty and harmonious form for the emergence of man in Wynter's sense. But I also want to emphasize a different aspect of Wordsworth, focusing on the relationship between forbidden forms of knowledge, memory, memorialization, and poetic form. If Roberson's lucid interval is about the moment between excitation and contemplation, thematized through the imaginative imprint of the living child, much of Wordsworth's early poetry, especially the Lucy poems or the lyrical ballads, concerns the impressions left by the dead child. So we might think about the last lines of Wordsworth's "She dwelt among the untrodden ways," which I'll just read, and you'll hear the balladic form. You'll hear where it breaks. I'll read it twice. She lived unknown, and few could know when Lucy ceased to be, but she is in her grave, and oh, the difference to me. She lived unknown, and few could know when Lucy ceased to be, but she is in her grave, and oh, the difference to me. The poem features a few of Wordsworth's recurrent tropes from this period anyway, particularly the idea of a kind of beauty that's unknown to others, quote, the violet by a mossy stone half hidden from the eye, that the poem may be, in quoting Wordsworth, habitually impelled to create where he does not find them. But the poem is maybe most famous for the ways that the knowledge of death interrupts the very mechanism of the poem, creating a syncope or stumble in the meter. The difference to me scans is 5 meters, and I'm sorry, for those of you who are not poetry scholars and for whom scansion was traumatic, it's just the difference to me, right? It's 5 syllables and it should be 6. I won't say a single thing about iams or any of that. So there's a kind of, it scans as 5 syllables rather than the required 6, and while some ingenious prosodist might be able to make sense here, insisting that it would be the difference to me, that's not how English meter in that period really worked, would be my point. I want to insist that in fact there's just something that breaks there. And so it's important to stick with the ways that this child's death impresses itself upon the poem in a way that threatens its function. Meter for Wordsworth, after all, serves to make the dull more interesting and the too interesting more bearable. So, but the poem is made to bear it, and its form is deformed by the weight it strains under. Something about this child's death refuses assimilation or accommodation by the poet's project. Just when one expects a disclosure, the poem instead demurs, sticking to the blunt fact. She is in her grave, and oh, the difference to me. What difference is that, you might wonder? What did you feel obliged to do? What did you go on to do? What was the cause of her death, and so on? That occulted difference, personalized and obscured, is paradoxical, and the paradox leads me back to my conception of the post-lyric. How does Wordsworth's project change when Lucy lived unknown, but in death became known, and her name became a cenotaph or hashtag, allowing mourning at a distance? How does one have a personal, private experience of someone else's public death, and can one recollect the knowledge of that death in tranquility? That's Wordsworth's definition of the poem, is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling recollected in tranquility. And so by way of, and we could go to Rankine, but I went to Hartman to extend these questions on the ways that a kind of interminable, and this is Hartman speaking about the interminable grief engendered by slavery and its aftermath, which I think gets into some of what Rankine has been up to. So quoting Hartman, "How might we understand mourning when the event has yet to end? When the injuries not only perdure, but are inflicted anew? Can one mourn what has not yet ceased happening?" In order to substantiate my claim that there is something particular about these uses of the lyric, without suggesting a homogeneity of experience, consciousness, or technique, without suggesting a common substance or matter of Black life and sociality, I want to suggest that the terms under which Black social life unfolds implies a different relationship to time, memory, and recollection, where the latter has more to do with keeping the event open rather than shoring up a subject's self-knowledge. So it's about refusing to assimilate certain kinds of experience, and that typifies a certain strain of, at least, African-American experience. And so this is going to bring me finally to Citizen. Can I just ask, and this might be, and forgive me, but have you all read Citizen? Have any of you? Can I? So just a few. Citizen is, in some ways, a sequel to her 2004 poem, Don't Let Me Be Lonely. It's primarily written in the second person, and primarily what she did was, her method, for part of it anyway, was to go and collect stories from friends and associates about racial microaggressions, and then to kind of filter those through her own poetic voice and through the second person. So there's a series of relatively small slices that in the flow of the book just accumulate. That's one thing that the book does. Another thing that it does is really memorialize people and events like the murder of Mark Duggan in London that sparks the riots there, and this is the shame of the moment is I'm forgetting another name of a person who was run over and killed. Not James Byrd, whom she memorializes in Don't Let Me Be Lonely, but yet another person. So Citizen might be best characterized by a mournful tone, that is, characterized by the vulnerability of the race and gendered body that precedes and permeates what one can call personal experience. The geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore, writing about prison, defined racism as, quoting her, a group-differentiated exposure to state-sanctioned premature death, whether administered by a hail of police bullets, lead-poisoned water, or the mass incarceration that day by day alters the lives not only of the inmate, but of families and whole communities. Claudia Rankine goes a step further, inscribing Black death within the texture of the quotidian. Writing in the wake of an attack on a prayer meeting at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, she argues, quoting her, "We live in a country where Americans assimilate corpses in their daily comings and goings. Dead Blacks are a part of normal life here, dying in ship hulls, tossed into the Atlantic, hanging from trees, beaten, shot in churches, gunned down by the police, or warehoused in prisons. Historically, there is no quotidian without the enslaved, chained, or dead Black body to gaze upon or hear about or to position itself against," close quote. That was in the New York Times, an article that's still available. The Condition of Black Life is One of Mourning, if you want to read the whole thing. Such framing, accounting for Black death as a different sort of dying, helps to rethink the temporality of recollection and of experience itself, both of which are central to traditional conceptions of the lyric. We might celebrate with Lucille Clifton another day that something has tried to kill her and failed, but the manner of celebration, remarking the vulnerability of the body alongside its pleasures, its durability alongside its fragility, is what I'm inclined to call mournful. Such celebration is about the rights of keeping and maintaining the body, localizing race in the specific contours of a life. I'm going to pause for a minute. And I believe Lucille Clifton's papers are here at Emory, so I'm really happy to be referring to her. It was a nice coincidence for me. So such celebration is about the rights of keeping and maintaining the body, localizing race in the specific contours of a life. in its particularity and singularity, what's most often missed or obscured in the statistical accounting through which Blackness tends to be considered. Such celebration asks that we consider the discontinuities that comprise any moment for the Black subject, and that we consider the continuous anticipation or experience of violence that shapes Black sociality, and that thus shapes such celebration. Referring to Don't Let Me Be Lonely, which like Citizen bears the subtitle in American Lyric, I wrote that the text use of images are part of a process of moralization. I'm going to quote myself, I think, for the last time. The images, like that which they imperfectly recall, recite, and resituate, are sensible without necessarily being meaningful. They draw our attention to the threat of erasure. The sensible, the ability to make those faces, those lives, and those deaths deemed unfit to mourn, and the sense of community that has allowed Eleanor Bumpurs, Amadou Diallo, Abner Louima, Sean Bell, Troy Davis, Trayvon Martin, and too many others to be mere names whose significance we are constantly on the verge, collectively, of forgetting, is put on trial. The we hinted at in the phrase American Lyric is put on trial. The poem does not call for expanding the sphere of public sympathy or redefining personhood, but for rethinking the demos and those procedures through which some human lives cannot matter, in Rankine's phrase, can be made structurally insignificant and disposable, visible only in narrative as a reminder of some people's proximity to disappearance. So I can confess now that this is one of those passages that I wrote surrounded by the continually unfolding violence that frames Black life, and my desire to see literature as doing something more than responding or speaking out, but attempting to perform epistemological transformation. To say that Black experimental writing is about imagining new livable futures is to say it makes a claim on the future that has not been imagined for all the men and women, many young and having young children themselves, whose life trajectories are permanently altered. And even writing that sentence, I should say that what was in the back of my mind, I started thinking about just that ongoing list that some of us keep of the people who we've lost, and just how young so many of them are. That these are, and I'm getting old, so I'm just going to put it this way, these are babies. And a 7, 8-year-old, a 20-year-old babies, and who get demonized as no demon, who's 18. What are you even talking about? Yet a 33-year-old Olympian causes an international incident, he's a kid. There's just something that's really, and that's part of that kind of skewed temporality around Black life that I've been thinking about and that I'm thinking about here. So Citizen, like Don't Let Me Be Lonely, continually plays in the doubleness of ordinary and ordinarily non-shareable moments. It's always between the kind of exemplary and the singular. Those poems play on or I think Citizen is one poem, but it plays in the multiplicity of a moment, as it happens, as it's recalled, as it's related, as it's differentially experienced, as a kind of temporal gap. The question, what did you say, becomes a motif, especially in the early parts of the poem, signaling those moments that rupture the fabric of the everyday, but also that are recurrent, familiarly estranging. In its more transgressive moments, it produces real temporal disorientation so that parts of the poem seem to speak to and respond to other parts, even though they're about seemingly unrelated events. Many commentators have noted the use of the second person, a formal decision made a theme in the poem's 5th section. The second person's intimacy and distance, its ability to be simultaneously commanding, accusative, or adoring, this is Erica Hunt's writing. Indeed, its ability to implicate those three and other modes of address help construct the atmosphere of embodied memory and imposed forgetting that defines its concept of citizenship. Yes, and this is how you are a citizen. Come on, let it go, move on, close quote. Rather than recalling and sharing powerful feeling, the call for race subjects, especially Black subjects, is to suppress it. This fifth section is, and so this section is one where what is worked out is the uses of you, and what is it to speak as an I. It's a very kind of, it's one of the more tonally aggressive sections of the poem. And my point would just be that it's trying to get at the limits of first-person reportage, the limits. It's a kind of self-questioning moment where its own project of collecting and gathering these stories, there's a question of, well, what is even the value of this when the I itself, the erased I, the first-person pronoun, is, is supposed to hold what is not there until it is, quoting her, but it often fails to do so, that something escapes from the very processes by which we constitute ourselves as subjects able to speak to and make demands on one another. That section also structurally plays out the untimely nature of racial violence, the microaggression, if the emphasis is on the micro rather than the aggression, misnames. As Rankine writes at an earlier moment, each moment is like this. Before it can be known, categorized as similar to another thing and dismissed, it has to be experienced. It has to be seen. In this section that I'm talking about, the moment experienced before narrated, so there's a kind of, you've experienced it before it's happened kind of logic there. And it's especially around a script involving an incident where a friend of hers was a victim of a stop and frisk, blocked from his house, arrested, pulled from his car, told that he resembled the suspect. And so he's strip searched, he's humiliated, his car is impounded, he's made to go home. And yet in the telling of it, it's told partially in the first person and partially in the second person. There's a way in which the person who's a lawyer says, I knew this was gonna happen. And so even though it's new, it's also totally anticipated and familiar. So I've only really begun to tease out some of the implications of this section for reading Citizen and imagining its modes of address and relating experience beyond the life study of the monumental first person. I want to try to bring this together by just kind of returning to the more general questions of mourning and what it is to write in this moment, what it is to try to write the present in this moment. So one thing that Citizen asks us, and these poems in the post-lyric mode asks us, are what modes of expression of the personal lie beyond the lyric? If mourning requires a body, or the phrase often used, the body, is often used in Citizen, or the I, a textual or signifying tradition interrogated as a corpus rather than interrogated as a canon, post-lyric verse as mourning work is one way of dealing with remains, one way of localizing loss without subordinating that loss to particular models of subjectivity and experience. In the longer version of this argument, I link this conception of mourning and embodiment to Audre Lorde's notion of the erotic as, quoting Lorde, a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. And Sharon Holland's argument that the erotic names, quoting Holland, the personal and political dimension of desire at the threshold of ideas about quotidian racist practice. Here I just want to underscore the degree to which Citizen in particular draws out the very chaos of the quotidian, the structured incoherencies of the ordinary, and the porous boundaries between public and private raced selves. One of Citizen's most valuable insights, and I'm moving to my conclusion, maybe this is understated insistence that in society structured around racial dominance, there is no separate space of recollection. In a time of racial terror, periods of tranquility are fleeting or illusory. Even the space of convalescence, the therapist's office in an early moment in Citizen, where a presumably black person goes to the therapist's house, the therapist kind of yells at her to get off my property before being reminded that the person actually has an appointment. And the therapist, of course, is a trauma specialist. So there's a kind of, and when Rankine read from that, she revealed the rest of the story is that, like the victim of the stop and frisk, the person involved, the actual person, went home and wept went through the therapy section, then went home to deal with the trauma that she just experienced. So that kind of what is public and what is private. If you can't have a private moment with your therapist, then clearly we need some other vision of the private, it seems to me. The worst injury, Rankine writes, is feeling you don't belong so much to you. And it's difficult for me, at least, not to read that particular anecdote as a companion to the story of racial profiling that I've mentioned, and through Don't Let Me Be Lonely, which has an extended kind of understated critique of medicalized mental wellness. So by way of conclusion, I just want to talk about one of the more difficult aspects of the poem, and that's page 134. On the first printing, there's a seeming dedication, November 23rd, 2012, in memory of Jordan Russell Davis. Davis, you may recall, was a teenager murdered by an adult white man, I'm refusing to name him, who objected to Davis's loud music, shot him to death, went home and ordered pizza. The facing page reads more obscurely, February 15th, 2014, the justice system. That was the date that the first jury returned a verdict of mistrial. Subsequent printings, still the same edition. So there have been a number of printings, but only one edition so far of Citizen, and this is going to be a real headache for us who write about it now and certainly in the future. Subsequent printings have expanded that memorial to include Eric Garner, so that she takes the date away and includes Eric Garner, John Crawford, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sharonda Coleman, Cynthia Hurd, Susan Jackson, Ethel Lee Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Clementa Pickney, Daniel Simmons Sr., Myra Thompson, and Sandra Bland, each dedicated in memory of. The phrase "in memory" runs down the left margin of the page, and eventually it fades out. The facing page now reads, "Because white men can't police their imagination, black men are dying," a haiku she wrote after visiting Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. That these are discrete printings, not editions, I mean, this is just going to be a headache. But I'm more interested by way of conclusion in the fact that Rankine replaces the date of the non-conviction with a list continually updated in line with Deion Brand's conclusion to inventory. Quote, "My job is to revise and revise this bristling list hourly." Earlier, I cited Saidiya Hartman's question about the status of mourning when the event is not ended. What I want to suggest here is that its non-closure is not just a project of the persistent recurrence of racial injury. Indeed, the proximity of racially differentiated vulnerability to injury, but also those acts of memorialization that prevent the event's closure. That it's about the kind of how do you avoid moving on and letting it go. Optimism, which is implicit in, however bruised, in Rankine's initial citation of the date of the first trial, and the collective rituals of anticipation and dread that that are in some black communities awaiting confirmation that the state does or does not recognize black claims to citizenship, is one way of keeping the event open. A different kind of optimism, perverse though it may seem, informs that repeated in memory, pointing to the ability of poetry to show how lives touch, rub against one another, and press themselves each on each. There will be more. There have been more. And someone will hold the space to name and embrace and remember them all. Some black person or people will survive to tell the tale. This is the confused space-time of Roberson's after, dedication and pursuit, anticipation and following. In that confusion, Citizen confronts readers with a contemporary world where official equal opportunity ideology can no longer adequately explain the various inequalities that make race, as a modality or medium of class, a continued alibi of exploitation and dispossession. That notion of citizenship, rooted in the interaction of sovereign subjects equally recognized before the law, emerges alongside lyricization. To ask, as I did before, what lies beyond the lyric is thus also to ask what political possibilities are there beyond or other than citizenship. Thank you.